It had been a quiet summer morning when he stepped out onto the small wooden dock that stretched over the lake. The water was still, almost like glass, reflecting the early sunlight in soft gold and silver hues. The air smelled fresh, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. For him, these mornings were sacred. They were a time to think, to watch the world wake up slowly, and to enjoy a peace that he had worked hard to preserve. He had always loved the lake. Growing up, it had been a place of freedom and adventure. A small slice of nature that felt untouched by the chaos of everyday life. Over the years, he had taken care of it, repairing docks, clearing paths, and making sure the water remained clean. For him, the lake was not just land and water. It was a part of his life, a place that represented everything he valued about calm, honesty, and fairness. That morning, however, something felt different. As he sipped his coffee and looked across the water, he noticed movement near the far shore. A group of people had appeared, setting up what looked like temporary docks and some small boats. At first, he thought maybe they were friends or neighbors who had come for an early morning ride. But as he watched more closely, a sense of unease settled in. They were acting as if they had every right to be there, moving equipment and arranging things without asking or notifying anyone. He frowned. This was unusual. The lake had always had rules, clear boundaries, and the few people who used it respected them. Seeing this group act so boldly without permission was unsettling. He decided to walk down the shoreline, following a narrow path that led closer to them, hoping to understand what was happening as he approached. He could hear them talking, but their voices were muffled by the distance. One thing was clear: they were organized, confident, and seemed to assume control over the lake as if it were theirs. He felt a surge of anger, not just because they were trespassing, but because their attitude showed a lack of respect for everyone else. Who cared for the lake? He stopped a few yards away and called out politely, "Excuse me, do you know this is private property?" The voices stopped, and several heads turned toward him. There was a moment of silence. Then one of them, a man who appeared to be leading the group, waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, we have permission. We're just setting up." "No harm done," the man said. His tone was casual, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he didn't believe he needed to explain further. He shook his head slowly, trying to remain calm. "I've maintained this lake and these docks for years. You can't just come in and claim it. There are rules, and this is private property." The man laughed softly, a sound meant to belittle rather than amuse. "Rules. Everyone here knows the lake is public. We're just exercising our rights. You can't stop us." He felt a tightening in his chest. He had expected some resistance, maybe polite disagreement, but this was different. This was an attempt to intimidate. Still, he reminded himself to stay calm. Losing his temper would not help. He needed to understand exactly what they were planning and find a way to protect what was his without escalating into unnecessary conflict. He retreated a few steps, nerving. The group worked quickly, arranging boats and securing temporary docks in a way that seemed almost strategic. They weren't just using the lake, they were claiming it. For a moment, he felt helpless. He had never dealt with a situation like this, and the thought of losing control over the place he had cared for all his life was frightening. Determined not to give up, he decided to take notes, mentally cataloging their actions, counting the number of people, the type of equipment, and how they moved. Every detail might become important later. As the sun rose higher, the lake became busier, the water now reflecting bright blue skies, but he couldn't relax. His focus remained sharp, and he knew he needed a plan. Later in the morning, he walked back toward his cabin by the lake, passing familiar landmarks. The old canoe resting on the grass, the rowboat tied securely to the dock, and the small shed that stored his equipment. Each of these things was part of the lake's history, part of his life. He couldn't let them be overshadowed by outsiders who didn't care about the place or the people who had nurtured it. He decided to talk to some neighbors, people who had lived by the lake for years and understood its value. As he spoke with them, he realized he wasn't alone in his concern. Others had noticed the group and were just as unsettled. Some had been thinking about ways to protect their rights but didn't know where to start. Together, they began discussing options, but he could see that fear and confusion made people hesitant. The lake was peaceful, and no one wanted to create unnecessary drama. Yet the presence of the intruders made it clear that action was needed. By midday, the situation grew more tense. The group on the lake became bolder, moving equipment closer to the main dock and trying to assert control over boats and access points. It was no longer a simple trespass. It was an attempt to establish dominance. The main character watched carefully, noticing patterns in their behavior. They seemed to believe that sheer numbers and speed would overwhelm anyone who tried to stop them. He knew that a hasty response could lead to conflict, but doing nothing would mean losing the lake. He returned to his cabin and began reviewing old documents, property deeds, agreements with neighbors, and previous permits related to the docks. As he read, he realized that while the outsiders claimed the lake, they had overlooked critical details about the docks and access points. It wasn't something that could be argued casually. It was a fact that could be used strategically. A plan began to form in his mind, a way to regain control without confrontation. Using the rules and evidence in his favor, as the afternoon sun climbed higher, he felt a renewed sense of determination. The lake was not just a body of water. It was a reflection of years of effort, care, and respect. He couldn't let it slip away. And while the day had started peacefully, it had become clear that vigilance, patience, and knowledge would be the tools to protect what mattered most. Evening approached, and the intruders began to leave temporarily, perhaps assuming they had made their point. The lake grew quiet again, the surface smooth and undisturbed, but the main character knew that this was only the beginning. He would need to be ready for the next day, to watch, to plan, and to take the steps necessary to ensure that the lake remained a place of fairness and respect. Sitting on the dock as the sun dipped toward the horizon, he felt a mixture of worry and resolve. This was not just about water and land. It was about standing up for what was right. And though the challenge ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing for certain: he would not back down. The lake had been part of his life for too long, and he would fight quietly, smartly, and firmly to protect it. As night fell, the lake seemed to breathe a soft sigh, the gentle ripple of water reflecting the moonlight. He sat in silence, watching, thinking, planning. The calmness of the night gave him clarity. The battle for the lake was only beginning, but he was ready to face it, knowing that every small action, every careful step, would be part of turning the tide in his favor. The lake was his responsibility, and he would meet the challenge with patience, strategy, and unwavering determination. And in that moment, he felt a quiet but growing confidence that, no matter what the intruders tried, he had a plan to protect the place he loved. The next morning, the lake seemed calm again. But there was a tension in the air that could be felt even without looking. The main character woke early, as usual, walking down the familiar path toward the docks. The morning mist hovered above the water, and the soft sounds of birds calling to one another filled the air. It was beautiful, peaceful, and yet he could feel that the peace was fragile. As he neared the lake, he noticed something immediately. The group from yesterday had returned larger than before. More people were setting up, and more equipment was being brought in. It was clear they were trying to make a statement, showing that they intended to stay, and that they thought they could take over without any real challenge. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. Yesterday had been a test of patience, and today he would need even more focus. He approached slowly, careful not to give them a reason to escalate the situation. He called out to them politely, but this time there was no hesitation. The group seemed to expect him and ignored his voice completely. Moving with purpose and confidence, he walked along the edge of the dock, observing how they were arranging things. Boats were being tied to different points along the lake. Temporary structures were being placed near key access areas, and there were even markers set up suggesting they were planning to control who could enter certain parts of the lake. It was becoming clear that they weren't just using the lake, they were trying to own it in practice. Feeling the tension rise, he decided to return to his cabin to gather papers, records, and any evidence that could help him protect the lake. He knew that confrontation alone wouldn't work. He needed facts, rules, and a plan. Pulling out old agreements and permits, he began reading carefully. highlighting the parts that could prove that he had authority over the docks and that these intruders were acting outside the law. Every page he turned added to his confidence. He was not powerless. He had knowledge on his side. Later that morning, he met with some neighbors who had lived by the lake for decades. They were concerned but unsure what could be done. Some suggested calling local authorities, while others wanted to approach the group directly. He listened to all suggestions, but reminded them that this needed to be done carefully. Any rash action could backfire. Instead, he proposed a strategy: use the facts, document everything, and assert control over the docks, which would give them a position of strength without conflict. Armed with this plan, he returned to the lake. The group was moving faster now, seemingly more confident than ever. He watched as a few of them tried to tie boats to the main dock, the one that he knew he had control over. His heart raced. This was the moment to act. He stepped forward calmly, holding the papers that proved ownership and control. "I'm sorry, but you cannot tie your boats here. This dock is private, and I have the authority to manage access." His voice was steady, firm, yet respectful. The group leader looked at him with a mix of surprise and annoyance. "We didn't think this dock mattered. We're just here for a short stay," he said, shrugging as if that explained everything. "Short stay or not, rules are rules," the main character replied. "You can't assume control over parts of the lake just because you're here first. These docks belong to those who maintain them. That's a fact, and it is supported by documents and agreements that are legally binding." For a moment, the group seemed uncertain. They whispered among themselves, clearly debating whether to push back or comply. He stayed calm, knowing that showing frustration or anger would weaken his position. Instead, he simply stood his ground, holding the papers where they could see them. Slowly, the group began to back off. One by one, the boats that had been tied to the main dock were untied, and the temporary markers were removed. It was a small victory, but an important one. The intruders were learning that this lake could not be taken over by force alone. Throughout the day, he continued to monitor their movements. He noticed that while they still floated on the lake, they kept a respectful distance from the main dock, unsure now of how far they could go. He documented everything, taking notes and photographs where allowed, creating a clear record of their actions and his responses. This would be useful if the situation escalated further or if formal action became necessary. Neighbors began to feel reassured, seeing that someone was taking control. Some even offered to help, not with confrontation, but by keeping watch and sharing information. There was a growing sense of community, a quiet bond forming among those who truly cared about the lake. It became clear that protecting the lake wasn't just one person's responsibility. It was a shared effort based on respect, knowledge, cooperation. By late afternoon, the group had reduced its activity, perhaps realizing that their attempts were not going unnoticed. They remained on the lake, but their confidence seemed diminished. The main character felt a mix of relief and vigilance. This day had been a success, but tomorrow could bring new challenges. He knew that controlling the docks was only one piece of the puzzle. Staying alert and prepared was the key to maintaining order. As the sun began to set, casting long golden reflections across the water, he walked along the shoreline, inspecting each dock carefully. Every plank, every rope, every post mattered. By understanding the structure and rules, he could anticipate problems before they happened. The lake had always been a place of beauty and peace, but it was also a place that required attention, especially when others tried to disrupt it. That evening, he returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. The lake was under pressure, but he had proven that knowledge, calmness, and persistence could make a difference. He spent time reviewing notes, organizing documents, and preparing for the days ahead. Each decision, each observation, each careful step was part of a strategy that would ensure the lake remained under proper control. As night fell and stars reflected on the still water, he felt a quiet determination. This was not about winning a confrontation or proving superiority. It was about protecting a place of value, ensuring fairness, and standing up for what was right. The intruders had tried to assert control, but by focusing on rules, evidence, and steady action, he had turned the first small corner of the battle in his favor. In the calm of the evening, he sat on the dock, listening to the soft lapping of the water against the posts. The lake was quiet again, but the challenge was far from over. Tomorrow would bring more tests, more bold moves from those who thought they could take over. But he felt ready. With clear rules, the support of neighbors, and careful planning, he knew that the lake could remain a place of respect, fairness, and quiet peace. And in that thought, he found strength, knowing that the lake would not be lost as long as he stayed vigilant and smart. The next morning arrived with a clear sky, and the lake looked serene as usual. But the calm surface hid the tension that had been building for days. The main character walked along the familiar path, observing the lake and the docks. The group of intruders had returned again, and this time they seemed more organized. There were new boats, more equipment, not even temporary signs, marking areas as if they already owned parts of the lake. He felt a mixture of frustration and determination. Yesterday had been a small victory, but it was clear that they were not going to give up easily. The first 2 days had taught him one important lesson. These people relied on confidence and assumptions. They assumed that their presence alone could intimidate others into submission. The key now was to find a leverage point that they could not ignore. After watching their movements for a while, he returned to his cabin to review all the documents he had gathered. He looked at property records, dock ownership papers, and previous agreements with neighbors. He realized that while the intruders argued over access to the water, they had overlooked the most important part, the docks themselves. He had legal control over them, and that control gave him the upper hand. Armed with this knowledge, he began formulating a plan. He would not confront them with anger or aggression. Instead, he would use rules, facts, and structure to assert authority. By controlling the docks, he could determine who could tie boats, who could use equipment, and ultimately who could access certain parts of the lake safely. It was subtle, but it would be effective. Later in the morning, he returned to the lake, carrying printed copies of the documents. The intruders were busy placing more boats and equipment, clearly trying to establish dominance. He approached the main dock, the one under his control, and stood firmly, holding the papers where they could see them. "This dock is private," he called out clearly. "You cannot tie boats here without permission. These documents show the agreements and rules that govern access. Everyone must follow them." The group leader looked surprised, as if this information had never occurred to him. He glanced at the papers and muttered to the others. The main character remained calm, making no move to escalate the situation. His presence alone, backed by evidence, was already unsettling them as he watched. Some of the intruders began to hesitate, unsure whether to push forward or comply. He maintained his position, speaking in a steady, firm voice whenever necessary. Slowly, the intruders began removing their boats from the main dock. Realizing that control of the water alone would not give them the advantage they had hoped for, he then focused on the smaller docks around the lake, checking for any unauthorized activity. By maintaining control over these points, he was able to regulate access more effectively. He noticed that some of the intruders were trying to tie boats to less secure areas. He approached calmly, explaining the rules and showing the documents that established his authority. The group became more cautious, realizing that their attempts to assert dominance were being met with knowledge and preparation rather than confrontation. Neighbors, who had been observing from a distance, began to feel reassured. Some approached quietly to offer support, sharing information about the intruders' movements. Together, they created a network of observation, a way to stay informed and coordinated without resorting to hostility. The main character realized that protecting the lake was not just his responsibility, it was a shared effort that required communication, awareness, and consistency. By midday, the intruders had reduced their activity significantly. They were still on the lake, but their confidence had waned. They were learning that the main character understood the rules and had evidence to back up every action. The power of knowledge and preparation was becoming clear, and it was giving him an advantage he had not fully realized before. He spent the afternoon reinforcing the docks, checking ropes, securing equipment, and making small improvements that would ensure control over access points. Each step was deliberate, showing that he was proactive rather than reactive. By strengthening the physical structures and being visible, he sent a message. The lake was being watched and managed by someone who cared and was capable. As the sun began to lower in the sky, the intruders appeared to be planning their next move carefully. They were still bold, but there was caution in their actions now. The main character noticed patterns in their behavior, small weaknesses in their approach that could be used to maintain control without direct confrontation. This was not about winning through force. It was about strategy, timing and understanding the environment. In the evening, he gathered with a few neighbors to review the day's events and discuss possible next steps. They went over observations, documented incidents, and planned for monitoring the lake in the coming days. Everyone agreed that knowledge, patience, and communication would be their tools. Any rash action could create unnecessary conflict, but careful. Consistent measures would protect their shared interest in the lake. As night fell, the lake seemed to breathe a soft sigh of relief, calm and reflective under the moonlight. The main character sat on the dock, thinking through the next steps. He knew the intruders would return, and he knew they might try new tactics, but he felt confident in his approach. Controlling the docks was not just about authority. It was about creating boundaries, enforcing fairness, and ensuring that respect for rules outweighed force. He reflected on the lessons of the past 3 days. Patience matters. Observation is key, and understanding the true source of leverage can turn a situation around. The lake had always been a place of peace, but now it was also a place that demanded awareness and action. By combining calm determination with strategic use of facts and control points, he could protect it without creating unnecessary conflict. That night, he walked along the shoreline one last time before returning to his cabin. The water was still. The stars reflected on the surface, and the air was quiet, except for the soft sounds of nature. He felt a quiet confidence growing within him. The intruders had tested him, but he had found a way to respond effectively. He knew the challenges were far from over, but he also knew that with the right approach, the lake could remain a place of fairness, respect, and peace. Sitting on the dock, he reviewed in his mind the plan for tomorrow. The intruders might return with new tactics, but he was prepared to respond with knowledge, calm, and strategy. Each step he took, each decision made, was part of ensuring that the lake remained under proper control. It was a delicate balance of patience, observation, and assertiveness. But he felt ready. As he watched the moonlight dance across the water, he realized that protecting the lake was about more than just physical space. It was about standing up for what was right, using intelligence over force, and ensuring that respect for rules prevailed. With that thought, he felt a deep sense of purpose, knowing that the lake was not only a place he loved, but also a reflection of his ability to face challenges with clarity, strategy, and unwavering commitment. The following morning, the lake looked calm, almost inviting, but the main character knew better. The intruders had returned, and their confidence seemed slightly shaken. He had spent the previous days observing them, understanding their patterns, and quietly asserting control over the docks. Today, he was ready to turn the situation in his favor more actively. As he walked toward the main dock, he noticed that the intruders were moving cautiously. Their boats were no longer tied carelessly. They seemed hesitant, unsure of where they could or could not go. It was a small change, but significant. Meant that his previous actions asserting authority calmly and consistently were having an impact. He carried with him the documents that proved ownership and control over the docks. He had also prepared additional materials, notes, and evidence of the intruders' movements over the past days. The goal was not confrontation, but clarity. By making the rules undeniable and visible, he could make the intruders recognize that the lake was not theirs to claim. Standing at the main dock, he called out politely but firmly, "These docks are private, and access is regulated. Anyone using them must follow the rules. This includes tying boats, using equipment, and entering certain areas. Here are the agreements and permits that govern these docks." He laid the documents out where they could be clearly seen. The intruders paused, whispering among themselves. The leader looked frustrated but could not argue against the clear evidence. The main character remained calm, watching their expressions, noting hesitation, uncertainty, subtle signs of recognition that they had miscalculated. He decided to reinforce his position with subtle but effective actions. He started by securing ropes, marking proper docking areas, and placing small, clearly visible signs indicating that certain areas were under private control. Each step was deliberate, showing care and preparation rather than aggression. By doing so, he demonstrated authority through action, not force, making it difficult for the intruders to challenge him without clear evidence of wrongdoing on their part. Neighbors, who had been quietly observing and supporting him, began to step forward more actively. They offered to keep watch, note any unauthorized activity, and share information. This network of awareness amplified his efforts. Suddenly, the intruders were facing not one person but a small community who cared about the lake and understood the rules. The balance of power was shifting without a single loud confrontation. Throughout the morning, he monitored the intruders' movements closely. They tried to tie boats in unauthorized areas, test boundaries, and challenge his control subtly. Each time, he responded calmly, pointing to the rules and the evidence. Slowly, their confidence began to erode. They realized that their assumptions about control, numbers, and intimidation were incorrect. By midday, the intruders had noticeably slowed down. They were no longer moving boldly. Their actions became cautious, and they seemed to be negotiating among themselves. It was clear that they were beginning to understand the limits of their authority and the consequences of ignoring the rules. The main character had established a psychological advantage by demonstrating knowledge, preparation, and steady control. He continued to patrol the docks and surrounding areas, checking for any activity that might challenge his authority. Each inspection, each step, each visible action reinforced the boundaries and clarified the rules. By focusing on structure and visibility, he ensured that the intruders understood that control was not arbitrary, it was based on facts, agreements, and consistent enforcement. Neighbors began to participate more visibly. Some helped with signage. Others recorded activities to maintain clear documentation, and a few offered moral support. The intruders could see that they were no longer just dealing with one determined individual, but with a coordinated group committed to upholding the rules. This shift in perception was critical. Confidence that had seemed unshakable before now faltered. As the afternoon wore on, the intruders attempted to hold a small meeting near the docks, likely discussing strategy. The main character approached calmly, standing in a position that made his presence clear without being confrontational. These docks are private, and any use must follow established rules. The documentation here shows the agreements and permits that govern access. Unauthorized activity is not allowed. The leader looked at the papers and then back at him. There was a moment of silence, a pause, where realization dawned. They had assumed they could take control by showing up and moving quickly. They had not considered that authority, preparation, and knowledge could outweigh numbers or boldness. Slowly, they began to acknowledge that they had miscalculated, their demeanor shifting from defiance to cautious compliance. By late afternoon, the intruders had withdrawn slightly, focusing only on areas where their actions could not be directly challenged. Even then, they moved more carefully, aware that any mistake could be documented and used against them. The main character had turned the situation in his favor by controlling the most important leverage points, the docks, and the clarity of the rules. He spent the remainder of the day reinforcing boundaries, checking equipment, and coordinating with neighbors. Communication remained key. By sharing observations and updates, they maintained a consistent approach that left little room for the intruders to act recklessly. It was not about confrontation. It was about clear, consistent management. As the sun began to set, casting reflections across the water, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The intruders had tested him, but their attempts to assert control had been carefully and effectively managed. The balance of power had shifted without escalation, and the lake was once again under order and respect. The docks, the key leverage point, were firmly controlled, and the intruders now understood that their previous tactics were ineffective. Sitting on the dock in the soft glow of evening, he reflected on the events of the day. patience, knowledge, and preparation had proven stronger than intimidation and assumptions. By focusing on the facts, maintaining visibility, and coordinating with the community, he had not only protected the lake, but also established authority in a calm, unshakable manner. The lake was peaceful once more, at least for now. The intruders remained, but their confidence was broken, their movements cautious, their assumptions corrected. The main character knew that tomorrow might bring new challenges, but he felt ready. He had discovered the leverage that mattered and had turned the tide without confrontation. Using calm strategy, consistent enforcement, and clear authority, as night fell, he sat quietly, listening to the gentle ripple of the water and the sounds of nature. The lake was calm, the docks secure, and the intruders aware of the limits they could not cross. This was not just a victory for property or rules, it was a demonstration of patience, strategy, and the quiet power of preparation. And in that stillness, he felt certain that the lake would remain a place of respect, fairness, and peace, protected not by aggression, but by knowledge and careful action. The morning after the previous day's events arrived with a gentle calm over the lake. The air smelled fresh, and the soft light of dawn reflected off the water, making it sparkle like tiny diamonds. For the main character, mornings had always been a moment of reflection, a chance to think and plan for the day ahead. Today, however, there was a sense of anticipation. The lake had been quiet overnight, but he knew that the intruders had not given up. Their presence remained a challenge, though their confidence had waned as he walked toward the docks. He noticed that the intruders had gathered near the shoreline, whispering among themselves, looking uncertain. Their previous attempts to assert control had been carefully countered, and now they seemed unsure of their next move. The main character felt a quiet satisfaction. The shift in their behavior was clear. They had realized that control of the docks, backed by evidence and consistent enforcement, was more powerful than their earlier boldness. He approached the main dock calmly, carrying copies of the documents, notes, and photographs he had gathered over the previous days. He placed them where they could see clearly and spoke in a firm but measured tone. "These docks are private. Use without permission is not allowed. All access is governed by these agreements and permits. Anyone using the docks must follow these rules." The intruders hesitated, exchanging glances. There was no defiance this time, only careful observation and consideration. They had learned that their assumptions were wrong and that the lake was not a place they could claim by force or speed alone. The main character stood quietly, his calm presence reinforcing the authority of the rules and the evidence he displayed. Throughout the morning, he continued to monitor the docks and surrounding areas, ensuring that all activity was compliant with the established rules. Any attempt to tie boats or use equipment without permission was met with calm enforcement in reference to the documents. Gradually, the intruders began to adjust their behavior, sticking to areas where access was clearly allowed and avoiding any attempts to challenge his authority. Neighbors who had been supporting him quietly stepped forward to reinforce the sense of order. They offered observation, shared information, and helped maintain clear documentation of the intruders' actions. Their presence made it clear that the lake was protected not just by one person, but by a community committed to fairness and respect. The intruders, seeing this unity, became even more cautious. By midday, a subtle but significant change had taken place. The intruders were no longer trying to dominate the lake. They moved carefully, followed the rules, and avoided the main docks. It was clear that they had accepted the boundaries. It's not out of fear, but out of recognition that the lake was being managed by someone knowledgeable, prepared, and calm. Their previous confidence had been replaced by caution, and they seemed to understand that their assumptions about taking control were flawed. The main character spent the afternoon reinforcing boundaries, checking the docks for any potential issues, and coordinating with neighbors to ensure that the rules were understood and followed. By taking consistent, measured actions, he had not only maintained control, but had also established a culture of respect. The lake, once a place of quiet personal reflection, had become a space where fairness and clarity were evident to all. As the sun began to lower in the sky, the intruders appeared to be considering leaving for the day. They gathered their equipment carefully, no longer moving boldly, but with awareness of the rules they had previously ignored. The main character observed quietly, allowing them to make their choices without confrontation. Their gradual withdrawal was a sign that his strategy had worked. The balance of power had shifted, and control had been restored. Neighbors came together in the evening to review the events of the day, discuss observations, and plan for ongoing monitoring of the lake. There was a sense of shared responsibility and quiet satisfaction in knowing that the lake was protected, not through aggression, but through knowledge, preparation, and calm enforcement. The intruders were still present, but they understood that their actions were limited, and that the main character, along with the community, was prepared to maintain order. As night fell, the lake reflected the stars, calm and peaceful. The main character sat on the dock, listening to the gentle lapping of the water and reflecting on the lessons of the past days. Patience, observation, knowledge, and strategy had proven stronger than boldness, assumptions, or intimidation. He had protected the lake without conflict, establishing authority through clarity, calm, and consistent action. The intruders had tested him, but they had been met with preparation and determination. They had attempted to take control, but the docks, the key point of leverage, had been firmly managed. The community had supported him, and together they had restored respect for the rules and for fairness. The lake was once again a place of peace, where boundaries were clear and the natural beauty could be enjoyed without worry. As he sat quietly, the moonlight reflecting on the water, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The lake had been defended not with anger or confrontation, but with knowledge, preparation, and calm strategy. The intruders had learned their limits, and respect had been restored. It was a victory not only for the individual, but for the shared values of fairness, patience, and understanding. Looking across the water, he realized that the lake would remain a place of reflection, beauty, and order. The intruders, having experienced the effectiveness of calm strategy and knowledge, would think twice before attempting to assert control again. The docks were secure, the rules were clear, the community was united. As he walked along the shoreline one last time that night, he felt a sense of peace. The lake was safe, the intruders were contained, and the lessons of patience, preparation, strategic action had been reinforced. In the quiet of the night, he knew that the lake would remain a place of respect, fairness, and calm, protected not by force, but by wisdom, care, and thoughtful action. The battle was over, and the lake, his lake, had been preserved. The lake had returned to a sense of calm after the challenges of the past week. But the main character knew that vigilance was always necessary. Even though the intruders had recognized the authority and control he and the community had established, there was no room for complacency. He rose early that morning, as he always did, and walked along the familiar path to the docks. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and the gentle aroma of the lake water. Everything appeared peaceful, but he could feel the weight of responsibility as clearly as he felt the ground beneath his feet. As he approached the main dock, he noticed subtle changes around the lake. Some of the intruders' boats had remained moored in areas they were allowed to use, but it was clear they were testing boundaries. He observed their movements carefully, taking note of small signs that suggested they were still uncertain about their position. He smiled quietly to himself, knowing that he could use this uncertainty to maintain control and reinforce the rules without conflict. Today's focus was not confrontation, but continued establishment of order and reinforcement of boundaries. He inspected each dock thoroughly, checking the ropes, the planks, and the access points. Each element had to be in proper condition to prevent misunderstandings or disputes. He took notes, documenting his observations meticulously. This record would ensure that any future issues could be addressed with clarity and authority. Neighbors who had been quietly supportive over the past days began to join him more actively. They brought tools, prepared signs, and offered assistance with monitoring the docks. Their participation was not just helpful, but symbolic. It showed that the lake was valued by a community, not just an individual, and that the rules and boundaries were supported collectively. This understanding of shared responsibility would reinforce the position of authority and reduce the chance of further disputes. The main character decided to engage the intruders in a calm and structured conversation. He approached them without any tension, carrying the necessary documents to demonstrate rules and agreements. "These docks and access points are private and regulated," he said calmly. "Everyone using the lake must follow the established guidelines. We are maintaining fairness and safety, not restricting enjoyment. The documents here show how access is managed.